On this episode of Booked on Rock, it's a deep dive into Kiss on film, TV, and home video. The early appearances, the bizarre, the funny, the forgotten, the famous, the infamous. We cover it all. Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, John Harrison, author of Creatures of the Screen, the uncensored and unofficial history of Kissploitation on film, television, and home video. Thanks for being on the show, John.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Nice to be here.
This is a rare insight into Kiss. There's a lot of Kiss books out there, but I think you even said, I don't believe there's really anything out there that covers the history of Kiss on the screen, the big screen, small screen, home video.
Yeah, no, I always sort of had it in the back of my head that I'd love to write a Kiss book someday. Just wanted to wait until I found a good angle for one, because as you mentioned, there's so many Kiss books out there these days, both official and unofficial. And I'd written a couple of articles over the years about Kiss covering different aspects. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote for an American magazine a fairly in-depth article about Gene Simmons' acting career in the 80s after they took off the makeup. He had was on a bit of a roll there, acting in movies like Runaway and Wanted Dead or Alive, Never Too Young to Die, usually playing the villain. So that created a bit of a spark. I was kind of like, yeah, that might be a good idea for a Kiss book, looking at their history, but concentrating on their history, both on film, television, and home video. But also I wanted to dive into the influence that they had over other shows. There was a lot of shows like The Love Boat and Scooby-Doo and Chips, back in the 70s and 80s, and The Incredible Hulk that had very Kiss-like characters that were obviously inspired by the band and their popularity and their unique look and style. It's always easy to tell when something in a movie has been influenced by Kiss because they're so uniquely distinctive. And the more I sort of examined it, the more I found out there, in terms of like movies and TV episodes that have been inspired by Kiss or in some way Kiss mentioned or Kiss centric. So I kind of thought, that would be a great angle for a book, and one that hopefully would be a little bit unique and not one that covers a subject that's already been covered before. There's been a couple of books that have sort of touched on their work and in film and TV. And there's been a couple of books that concentrated solely on their TV movie, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. But as far as I'm aware, this is the first book that just concentrates purely on an overview of all their film and TV work, as well as, as we've mentioned, all the movies that have been inspired and influenced by them.
In depth, and it goes back all the way to 1974, where we see the first appearance by Kiss on TV. Let's get into those early TV appearances. Their manager, Bill Aucoin, was able to get them on 2 TV shows early, which is impressive since those appearances were usually reserved for established acts. What were those early appearances? The first ever, March 29th, 1974.
That's right. I think Bill Aucoin, with his background in television as a producer of Flipside and, just his connections, I think he was fortunate for the band in terms of he had those connections to be able to get them spots on TV shows that were fairly sort of big for a new up-and-coming band. And their first appearance obviously was on the Mike Douglas Show in 1974, not long after their debut album had come out, and that was like a daytime TV show, and you could just imagine all these people at home sipping their cups of tea at lunchtime and suddenly being bombasted by Kiss, wondering what the hell's going on. And of course, they came on and sung Firehouse on the Mike Douglas Show, but prior to that, they brought Gene out.
I want you to meet one of the members of this act close up. Here from Kiss is Gene Simmons.
Excuse me while I spread my wings.
Oh, yeah, go right ahead.
Gene, what are you?
I'm really just a member of Kiss.
Who dreamed this up, this get-up?
We all did.
How many members in the
There are
group?
4 members. Your audience really looks appetizing.
Oh, really? Are you a bat?
Yes. Actually, what I am is evil incarnate. And some of those cheeks and necks look really good.
Gene was obviously pretty nervous, but did quite well and created quite an impression with the other guests. And for a first appearance, I think it was a really good one and a really unique one. And it's great that the footage has survived for us to be able to look back on it and appreciate it. There was a couple of other shows that they did. There was one in Canada called Boogie, which I'd love to see, but unfortunately, apart from a few stills, the footage has apparently been lost. So A lot of those shows back then, especially like a lot of regional shows, they probably wiped the tapes after they'd finished the episode. But, you never know. You always hold out that something might surface in some collection somewhere at some point.
A little piece of trivia. I can't remember the comedian's name. The one that was kind of teasing Gene, she's from right nearby here. You're in Australia. I'm in the U.S. in Connecticut. Just
And
like
she
30
teases
minutes
Gene
from here.
about, does your mother know what you're doing? And then she said,
It'd be funny if under this he was just a nice Jewish boy.
You should only know.
Where you
I do. You can't hide the hook.
if you listen to the tape carefully, I think you can hear Ace Frehley's distinctive laugh in the background.
Oh,
The
really?
band were obviously, I guess, setting up on the stage, ready to perform. And yeah, that joke, if you listen to it, you can definitely hear his high-pitched laugh there in the background.
Oh, you can't miss that.
Toddy Fields, was it? I think
Oh,
is the
yeah,
name,
yeah.
Toddy Fields.
I believe you are correct. Yeah, and she's from
Yeah,
Hartford.
very
And
funny. They had a great chemistry together on the show. And
Toady, yeah. She does the
Toady,
eye
yeah.
roll, like, who the hell is this kid?
What on earth? Yeah.
Which is indicative of that point in time where there's this generational gap, between
Absolutely,
older
yeah.
and the younger. Yeah.
Whereas now a lot of the early Kiss fans are sort of as old or older than what Toadie was then,
Sure. Yeah.
And also, because it was something new, she's rolling her eyes. No one had really seen anything like Kiss. You had Alice Cooper, I guess, and David Bowie with his Ziggy Stardust makeup. But I think Kiss definitely took it to the extreme. And to see Gene walking out there for the first time, not knowing what to expect, I think a lot of people would have been shocked, and probably a lot of people who were experienced would have just rolled their eyes like Toadie, like, people will try anything to, get attention sort of thing.
Yeah. They'll come and go. They'll be gone in 15 minutes. Here we are 50 years
Yeah.
later. Now, was In Concert the second one? Is that Follow Mike Douglas show?
Dick Clark's In Concert, I think, was the first appearance of Kiss live, yeah. And obviously these shows, they weren't broadcast live. A lot of them were pre-recorded, and some of them were broadcast a couple of months after the recording. But Dick Clark's In Concert, where they performed, I think, 4 songs, although I think maybe only 2 or 3 were aired initially. But yeah, that was purely like a performance segment, whereas the Mike Douglas show, was the first appearance that, at least that survived to this date, that had one of the band members on for an interview. That TV show I mentioned earlier, Boogie from Canada, I believe they did an interview segment on that as well. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, that footage has been lost.
In between In Concert and the Mike Douglas show is an appearance in St. Louis. But this was caught on film. There's surviving footage of Kiss, March 31st, 1974. What is on this film, and where can it be found?
That's the Kite Festival, I believe. Yeah, so that was a huge outdoor rock concert. There was probably, even to this day, maybe one of the biggest crowds Kiss has ever played to. And obviously they weren't the headliner that day. It was always sort of rumoured that there was footage existing, but none of it really surfaced until about 4 or 5 years ago, when they were putting together that history documentary for A&E. Some 8mm home movie footage of the Kite Festival was surfaced, and that can be found on the History DVD or Blu-ray that you can get or stream online. Very interesting, particularly because it's got Kiss playing in broad daylight, which is very strange to see, playing on an open stage in the middle of the day, But one of the great things about those things is it really creates a bit of a different atmosphere to seeing Kiss at night on a dark stage. Just see them up there on this, and you can tell it was like very windy because their hair's blowing everywhere, and you can actually see a couple of roadies sort of behind the speaker stacks at one point trying to brace them just so they don't blow over in the wind. Unfortunately, it's only like little snippets that have survived. It would have been great if the whole show had been broadcast or filmed, but of course back then, 8mm home movie cameras, they would only have a small roll of film that could maybe, handle 5 or 10 minutes. So people would just turn them on and off for the highlights, as opposed to like a VHS or a video recorder, or even like an iPhone these days, where you can just hold it up and record the whole show from go to woe.
I don't know. You may have had this. I'm sure so many Kiss fans had this. I think of probably early 2000s is when we get to that point where you got YouTube, but also there's a lot of file sharing. And I got a bunch of DVDs of all these concerts and footage and TV appearances and all this stuff. It was like a gold mine. I couldn't stop watching it, because you wondered as a kid growing up, what was it like? I wish I could see that show, and all those started to roll in.
Yeah, you always read about in books and especially out here in Australia, it was even harder to get hold of that stuff. And we never saw the tours that you did in America. We didn't get Kiss out here until 1980 for their first tour, by which time their career was already sort of pretty much on the downslide in America, their initial wave. And they didn't tour again here until 1995. So it was a good 15-year gap. So you had to rely on things like video and trading with other friends, trading bootleg tapes just to try and experience some of those Kiss tours from the 70s and 80s that we never got over here. But it was a golden era, like you say, and part of the fun and the nostalgia of it was the fans and other people that you met, whereas today, even though there's a benefit and I appreciate the fact that you can just go onto YouTube pretty much or go online and, bring up any concert that's recorded and watch it at the tip of your fingers. There was something about the old days where you had to go through the effort of trying to track something down and, you'd meet a friend and you'd trade.
Kiss conventions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you'd trade something that you had that they didn't have, and you made friends that way,
Oh,
So,
I hear you.
there's
Yeah.
good and bad things to say about modern technology and the way things are done today, but I kind of miss the camaraderie between
Yeah.
fans that you had when you were trading, because sometimes you'd talk with other collectors on the phone for hours, just about what you've got and what you want to trade, and that
Huge
again
part
was
of the
part of
fun.
the
Yeah.
fun of it. Yeah.
Going back to those early days, it is interesting, despite the TV appearances and radio exposure, Kiss struggled, but then you get to the live album, and that's when we know the band takes off. So let's get to the year 1975 now. The first show recorded for the album took place on May 16 at Cobo Hall in Detroit. But you say that the first official Kiss music clips were filmed on May 15th. Tell us about that. This is also when the front album photo was taken?
That's correct, yeah. So they did a bit of a rehearsal at a nearby hall, just getting ready for the shows. They knew they were going to be recording them, so they wanted to be, I guess, in tip-top shape. Yeah, they did the photo shoot for the iconic album cover at that rehearsal the day before, the full dress rehearsal. And I guess, again, Bill Aucoin, with his access to film and television equipment, decided to shoot a couple of short clips for two of the songs off the then current album, Dress to Kill, which were, of course, Rock and Roll All Night and Come On and Love Me. And they, I guess, became the first official Kiss music videos. And I remember as a kid in Australia seeing the Rock and Roll All Night one on a TV show over here we had called Countdown on Sunday night. So I think back then, that was the main function of music videos, even though they weren't really called, I guess they just called them film clips back then, or song clips rather than music videos. But yeah, it was mainly, I guess, done to send out to overseas countries where the band couldn't tour at that point, or just to other areas of the US, I guess, as well, where they weren't able to tour at that point, or they weren't playing, or just for TV shows to run if they were going to like do a bit of an interview with them as well, just as a bit of a taste of their show. And those clips were interesting because they included some of the stage effects like Gene breathing fire and the explosions and that. So they were great. They gave a good, I guess, encapsulation of what the live Kiss experience was. But you're right, they were definitely struggling still at that point. Their first three albums had done nothing, so they certainly weren't an overnight sensation. They still hadn't had a gold album, and you can imagine all the money that it was taking to keep the Kiss show on the road. And, I know Casablanca had gambled a lot of money putting out a double album of Johnny Carson show highlights, which they not only spent a lot of money on production-wise, but they'd also spent a lot of money clearing the rights to a lot of the celebrity voices and interviews and that were on it. And that album just totally bombed, so Casablanca were really on the verge at that point, and only really did a live album, I guess, just because they couldn't really afford to go into the studio to do another studio album. And with the first three not selling that well, there was also the thought of, well, what's the point of just going in and doing another album that's only going to sell a couple of 100,000 copies? And I think with Alive, it was kind of like their last roll of the dice. As we know now, of course, a lot of the album was touched up and re-recorded parts in the studio later on. But that's what happens with all live albums, really. None of them are 100% live. But I think with Kiss, it doesn't really matter. It's more about the experience of listening to it, where as a souvenir of what you imagine the Kiss show was like. I think Alive totally hit the nail on the head and just showed that, as the band members have said in the years since, there was nothing wrong with those first three albums. The songs were good, just people thought, well, it doesn't sound though what it's like live. It's not the live Kiss experience, whereas doing the songs for Live gave them more that raw feel that the songs had when they came across live, and thankfully worked out for them. It's still only, I think, officially only certified gold. They haven't applied to have the albums recertified in a long time, but it would have to be at least triple platinum at this
Oh,
point,
sure.
so it certainly did a lot more than,
Sure.
they were hoping. I think their initial hope was that if it went gold, that would at least keep them going and give them the motivation to keep going, but it just went beyond their wildest dreams, I
Sure.
guess.
Yeah, there's a famous story of a coin using his credit card, right? He pretty
That's
much
right. Yeah, yeah.
drained
Using
his
his
credit
credit
card.
card.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was also rumors about certain notorious Italian families sort of helping to finance the tour and then demanding their money back. Which I could certainly understand that. Bill Coyne and also Neil Bogart from Casablanca, or that's part of the parcel, I guess, of promoters back then. They all had some dodgy connections.
A few New York mobsters. Hey,
Yeah,
that stuff went down back in those days, so it wouldn't have been like an
yeah,
anomaly.
absolutely.
There was a
Yeah.
TV commercial to promote Alive. It remained unseen for decades. What was on that commercial, and why do you think it was never aired?
They'd already done an ad for Hotter Than Hell, which is really cool as well.
Yeah.
The year before, a TV commercial that did air, and that was really good. It gives us some clips of Kiss playing in the small club still, and there's footage of them clowning around in their motel room and on the way to the airport and in the limousine and that, which is really cool. But for Live, yeah, it was mainly just some shots of that pre warm-up show they did prior to Cobo Hall, of them doing the effects and just shots of the album cover and the booklet inside. And there's a great voiceover to the rock album of the year, Kiss Alive on Casablanca. Why it wasn't aired, I'm not sure. I don't think there's a specific reason. I can only maybe think that once the album started taking off on its own, maybe Bill Coyne thought, well, or Casablanca thought maybe the album's doing its own thing without the advertising, so let's save the money that it would have cost to get the commercial on air. Obviously, TV airspace isn't cheap, so they may have thought, yep, it's selling itself. It's about the only reason I could think of. The commercial was there and in the can, so I can only imagine it was a financial reason that they decided not to. But it's great that it did resurface, all these years later just to watch.
A fascinating moment in history is this Cadillac High appearance in Cadillac, Michigan, October 9th and 10th, 1975. For those not familiar, talk about this appearance and how it's possible that maybe more footage of this exists.
At Cadillac, Michigan, the local high school football team that were on a bit of a losing streak, and the coach decided that to try and get them fired up, he wanted a band to play their music in the locker room beforehand just to get them in the right mood. And he was a bit of a Kiss fan, so he decided Kiss music was the perfect thing to get them worked up. And Kiss, he said, was the same philosophy that he kept in his coaching, which is keep it simple, stupid, the old an acronym. So he thought, yep, Kiss is the perfect band. And I think once they started playing the music in the locker rooms, they won the next 9 or 10 games and made it to the playoffs. So I think the coach just sort of wrote to Bill Coyne and said, we've been using your music to get us fired up and we've reached the playoffs now and the finals. And I think they were initially just hoping that maybe Bill Coyne would send them a letter or something just to encourage them and provide a bit of support. But I think Bill Coyne, being the showman that he was, thought this is a great opportunity to do something really special. So rather than just send them a letter or a greeting or something, the whole band actually turned up to Cadillac for 2 days and did a lot of promotion, hang out at the school and talk to the school kids and mingled with the townspeople and even put on Kiss makeup for the mayor and all the town officials. They got the key to the city and then went to the football field and greeted the team. And they did a show as well at Cadillac High in the gym the night before the big game,
So
which
cool.
was amazing. Would have been amazing seeing Kiss in a little high school gym back then. It was pretty
Oh,
much the
man.
full Kiss show as well. I think the only thing missing was the logo, which they couldn't fit onto the stage because it was so small. So the students made their own homemade logo. Then the next day, a helicopter came and landed on the football field, and the band members jumped in the helicopter and off they took and dropped all these leaflets saying Cadillac High, Kiss loves you. So, yeah. And they also did the parade as well down Main Street. There was a lot of cameras there recording that. I guess local TV cameras as well as a lot of home movie cameras and stuff. So, there has been a lot of stuff that's surfaced over the years, but you always hope that maybe there's more. There could be other people that maybe were there with their home movie cameras and it's just sitting in a cupboard somewhere or, sitting at the back of a wardrobe somewhere and lost for years. But mainly it would be I guess the concert as well would be the thing that people would love to see. There's
So there's absolutely nothing we've seen from that concert? There's no
There's a
footage?
few
Or
segments, yeah, a few snippets of footage, but yeah, I've never seen like a whole complete song or a
oh,
complete audio recording of it. But
surprising
you
that the
know,
band didn't record all those things in the early days and have
yeah,
somebody
yeah.
film it, record it.
And I know, like when they did Cobo Hall and those places, those venues had their own sort of built-in video systems to project onto the screens behind the band, and thankfully a lot of those survived, put onto tape. But I know Kiss always in the 70s and 80s always tended to say, "Oh yeah, we've recorded every show we've ever done," but I think they were maybe embellishing or exaggerating a little bit there. But yeah, there's a few shows that I think, well, it's really surprising that Kiss didn't professionally have that film themselves, knowing what a big deal it was. Like you're going a few years later when Eric Carr, the new drummer, made his debut at the Palladium. You think, why would they not
That's
film
another
that?
one.
It's
Yes. It's so true. You would think that they would have done that. But again, who knows? Maybe in somebody's attic is
yeah,
some
that's
roll
it.
of
Yeah, just
film.
because it doesn't exist yet doesn't mean it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
there. There was some great footage of the Palladium that surfaced a few years ago, just like a news segment that ran on one of the New York TV news programs. Even just seeing that little snippet of footage was exciting to see.
Let's get to that legendary era of Kiss. 76 through 77 mostly, but right up through 1979. The Paul Lynde Halloween special in 1976 is one of the most well-known Kiss appearances. As you write, quote, it's remarkable not just because it features the first primetime appearance of Kiss, but for the simple idea that it even exists. This appearance represents a pivotal moment for Kiss. It is somewhat bizarre to see Paul Lynde and Kiss, but it did a lot for their
It
career.
is, but it's such a classic Kiss moment.
Where are the musicians?
Locked up in a little chamber. But I can summon them. Oh, they make such very soothing, quiet dinner music. You'll love them. We call them Kiss.
Oh, not unless you brush your fangs.
Okay, boys, play something a little peaceful for Mr. Lynn.
I think it really represents a moment where Kiss went from being just a rock band on the rise to becoming true superstars. And that was kind of like their entrance into pop culture, I think. It was their first primetime exposure as well. And just seeing Kiss, as you mentioned, with Paul Lynde, but also with Donny and Marie Osmond and Florence Henderson from the Brady Bunch and Witchy Poo from HR Puff and Stuff and the witch from The Wizard of Oz and just all these characters, it was such a perfect environment for Kiss to play around in. And we not only get to see all these great stars and bizarre skits with Paul Lynde and all the other guest stars, but you also get 3 great performances of the band doing Detroit Rock City, Peter doing Beth and King of the Nighttime World. And Paul Lynde was such an interesting, funny character as well. And we never saw it over here in Australia, unfortunately. I didn't see it until well into the 80s when I got it on like a VHS tape. But, I could just imagine how great and exciting it would have been to have been a fan back then in America and getting to see them. And I can only imagine it also brought in a whole lot of new fans as well that wouldn't have been aware of the band, who probably got turned on to them after that appearance on the show.
You quote Paul Stanley in the book. Kind of sad. Paul Lynde was not the happiest guy.
If you look at his appearances on, there's a Hollywood Squares, he was like the middle square person for years. And I think you could sort of see there in some of the barbs that he maybe had a bit of a cutting wit that could cut people down to size. And I think if you combine that sort of wit with heavy drinking, as Paul Lynde was known to do, it can often result in some fairly unpleasant behaviour. But yeah, I mean,
He could throw him back.
Great character and great actor as well. I remember him as a kid, just always seeing him show up in shows like Bewitched and The Munsters, and he was always just hilarious to watch.
That's right. He's great in The
him and
Munsters.
Kiss together were like a dream.
Yes, I forgot about that. I love The Munsters too.
I think it was like a doctor in The Munsters who maybe got Herman in for a physical. And of course, it was the classic thing where, as soon as he looked at Herman, his glasses just sort of like shattered.
Yeah. I have to believe Gene is a Munsters fan because we know he loves old monster movies.
Oh, you'd have to. Yeah.
Pivotal year for Kiss, 1978. Chapter 4 is titled Rock and Roll Superheroes. A lot of exposure, but this is where we start to see the overexposure of Kiss take effect. You have the original TV guide listing for the 1978 NBC special titled Land of Hype and Glory. This is the one where we find out about the band members' blood being used for the Marvel comic. And then on October 28th, 1978, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, aired on NBC.
He's the one, all right. Almost tore my arm off.
Gene's clean.
A pussycat. Almost. Hi, Curly.
Look, someone vandalized our park last night, smashed some of our buildings and injured a few of our guards. Well, Gene, they think it was you.
Think? It was him.
Or his twin.
Gene's brother was an only child.
Easy, Catman. They are serious.
And they've got guns.
This was Bill Aucoin's idea. The screenplay was given to two guys who didn't have all that much credibility.
Yeah, it was a couple of guys that, as you mentioned, didn't really have much experience. I'm not sure where they picked them out of, but they'd done a couple of low-budget sexploitation flicks, one called Too Hot to Handle. I guess at that point, they probably just went for whoever was cheap. You know, the whole project was based around how can we exploit Kiss. They got Kiss. I think they could have just put anything on paper and it would have sold. But yeah, I mean, that TV movie, as I said, was great exposure for the band, but I think maybe it ruined a lot of their mystique when people finally saw it. And in retrospect, it's a fun movie and their career did recover from it. But at the time, yeah, I think it disappointed a lot of people and really sort of, I guess, up until like in that sort of 74 to 76 period, Kiss was still seen as something of, you know, a bit of a dangerous sort of rock band. There was still a lot of controversy around about don't let your kids see Kiss. They'll recruit them into devil worshipping and they'll destroy their minds, you know, whereas by 78, kids had become the main Kiss audience, and Phantom of the Park certainly helped push that agenda. And that's probably something that Bill Aucoin and Kiss, Gene maybe in particular, were also pursuing, not realizing the damage it would likely have. But also you had in the lead up to the TV movie, you had the 4 solo albums as well that were released on the same day, and a lot of controversy there as well because they'd pressed so many of them. They pressed over 1 million copies of each one, and most of them came back unsold. And when they're offloaded to church fates and op shops and that was another sort of damaging thing for the brand, you know, because as a teenager, if you want your band to be the coolest, and certainly there's nothing cool about seeing one of your favorite band's records sitting there in the discount bin at the local church fete, you know, it doesn't
Right.
look very cool or dangerous. But, you know, it's also, I think, a lot of people don't sort of stop to think about just how much material they put out in that 4-year period between 1974 and the TV movie. It was like, you know, 6 studio albums, 2 live albums, a compilation, the 4 solo albums. It's when you look back and see all that discography, you think, wow, that's a really long, it makes you feel like it's a really long period of time, but really it was all done in like the case of a few short years. So I think even if the TV movie hadn't come about, I think there was maybe still going to be that risk of Kiss just totally like overexposing themselves to the point where there was bound to be some kind of blowback. And of course, all the merchandising on top of that, and the Kiss comic book, the famous Marvel Kiss comic book from early 1977, which was advertised as being printed in real Kiss blood. And of course, the funny thing there was even though they did genuinely go and donate their blood, I believe Bill Aucoin later sort of spilled the beans years later, like during the reunion period, where he said that there was actually some kind of mix-up. There was either a mix-up with the file delivery or Marvel didn't deliver the files for the comic in time. So the vat of red ink that had the Kiss blood in it, the majority of that was actually used to print that month's issue of Sports Illustrated, the one with Big Bird on the cover from 1977. So while some of it did end up in the actual Kiss comic book, most of it ended up in Sports Illustrated. So
Wow.
a lot of fans collect both the comic book and that issue of Sports Illustrated with Big Bird on it, just because I know that's the one that also had the Kiss blood. But it was such a great gimmick, though. You know, it obviously got them a lot of publicity, and there's a great news item from one of the New York news stations where the reporter is really snotty about it, saying very classy guys, you know, really like talking down about them, saying like what a rotten publicity act, you know, whereas
I've
compared to
seen
some
that.
of the stunts that people do these days, it's nothing, you know.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. If you've just discovered the channel, thanks for joining us. If you've been watching all along, can't thank you enough for your support. Make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you get updates on latest episodes, video highlights, and more. Now back to the show. John Harrison, author of Creatures of the Screen, the uncensored and unofficial history of Kissploitation on film, television, and home video. For me and many other Kiss fans, the band's appearance on The Tomorrow Show, which aired on Halloween night 1979, is my favorite, not for reasons Paul and Gene want it to be for. Ace steals the show here. Ace was drunk, guzzled champagne before the show, and it becomes the Tom Snyder Ace Frehley show. Ace is just cracking jokes, and you can see Paul and Gene just staring daggers at him. And Peter's loving it because he's sick of Gene and Paul.
Tell me about your outfits. I mean, did you design your own outfits, all of you? And tell me what each outfit means. And I'll start with you, Ace.
Well, that means a cucumber. I think this outfit is self-explanatory. I mean, you know, this is part of a kind of a V shape. This is my utility belt, and we don't want to go any below than my waist area because that's reserved for concert payers. Yeah.
I understand that. But, and after it's all over, they say, this is what we came for.
And that's what they always feel short. I stole this from Flash Gordon, and, you know, I have my cape. Yeah.
But you're kind of like a spaceman, huh?
No, actually, I'm a plumber. On the side. Look.
Well, listen, I got a little piece of pipe backstage I'd like to have you work on.
Tell me about it. Oh, you won't let it, but I was dead.
You old sweet talker, you.
There's a great essay in your book by Andrew Graves on this appearance, and he writes, quote, "The embarrassment doesn't or shouldn't belong with Chris or Frehley. The blame for the terrible atmosphere which ensues lies purely with Stanley and Simmons."
Yeah, I agree. I think with Gene and Paul, The Tomorrow Show was a very sort of serious late night TV show. I mean, Tom Snyder was someone that often had politicians and big political figures and real sort of intellectuals. So for Gene especially, and Paul, I think they saw The Tomorrow Show as their chance to really show the serious side of Kiss, to try and show how intelligent and clever they were. But unfortunately, as soon as Ace started opening his mouth, that sort of went downhill. And I think rather than go along with it and at least get into the spirit of it, Gene and Paul just decided to like really hunker down. And you can sort of tell Gene's just really miserable and doesn't want to talk about anything really exciting. There's a couple of shots here which you maybe didn't catch, you know, when you first saw it live, but with the benefit of video where you can pause it, you can really see Gene and Paul making dagger eyes towards Ace and Peter. And there's a great moment as well when Ace makes one of his jokes at the band's expense and everyone's laughing. Even Gene and Paul are sort of trying to laugh along with it as well, you know, to try and show a bit of solidarity. But you can actually hear Peter say under his breath, "That's funny, you're going to pay for that in the dressing room later." You know, so he sort of said, you know, Gene and Paul are going to kill you when you get back there. Look, obviously it's become one of the mythical appearances in Kiss history, and for good reason. It's not only funny and endearing, it shows that Kiss were real people with real issues and real problems. They weren't superheroes. And it was kind of like almost watching the band disintegrate before your eyes, you know, being a live show. And unfortunately, with a lot of this stuff too, being a kid in Australia at the time, we didn't get those shows. We never got The Tomorrow Show. Even Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park never aired over here on TV. We didn't get it till they re-edited it and released it to cinemas here in 1979 as Kiss in Attack of the Phantoms. So I had to actually pay to go and see it, you know, whereas other people got to see it in America for free. But it became a huge hit over here. You know, I played at cinemas for like about 18 months running, you know, because 1979 Kiss suddenly became like absolute megastars here in Australia. I remember the Kiss Attack of the Phantoms cut was still playing at cinemas here 2 or 3 years later in 1981.
It's amazing.
But The Tomorrow Show and things like the Paul Lynde Halloween special, you know, none of that was aired in Australia at the time. So a lot of it I read about. I collected rock magazines like Circus and Cream in the 70s and 80s. But a lot of that stuff I didn't get to see until later on, trading, as we talked about earlier, you know, trading videos at the Kiss conventions and things like that was when finally got to see all that stuff.
It's amazing.
So it was interesting for me as a fan to see that stuff years later in hindsight rather than seeing it live. So I always wonder how I would have felt, you know, if I was a kid in America and Kiss were my heroes, my favorite band, watching The Tomorrow Show live. What would I think? Would I think, yeah, go Ace, he's the real rock star? Or would I think, oh, what's happening to my favorite band? They just look miserable. They look like they're not getting on, and they're fighting. But
Well, was
but
that
yeah, Andrew, who's
his point is he should have lightened up a little bit and just rolled with it.
yeah, absolutely.
It could have all had fun with it, but they just made it worse by trying to pull it back to something that's serious. Just have fun with it.
And just made Gene and Paul themselves look more stuffy and humorless, But yeah, Andrew's piece is great. He's an English writer. He has a great podcast as well called T for Terror, where he invites a guest on to talk about one particular horror or genre exploitation movie that's influenced him. And being English as well, he's also got like a unique insight into Kiss as well, because Kiss didn't really gain popularity in England until they took off their makeup, which was kind of interesting. Lick It Up was like their first real top 5 album over there. And yeah, he's got a great insight. But yeah, I totally agree. They should have just lightened up and gone with the flow and said that's rock and roll. But there's another great interview that Kiss did just after that with, can't think of the name, but now I'll think of it later. But they were interviewing him backstage before the Dynasty concert. Ace starts making a couple of jokes, and you can sort of hear Gene in the back goes, "Oh, it's going to be another one." It's kind of like saying, "Oh, it's going to be another Tomorrow Show." But there was one, yeah, with Eric Carr that they did on top of the Empire State Building, where Ace is really clowning around and clearly on something. And that was actually done for the Australian TV show Countdown in the lead up as a special for the lead up to the Australian tour that year. But I think with Eric Carr too, he maybe brought a bit more solidarity to the band as well. Whereas Ace was kind of like the rowdy one. I think Peter was like, by the late 70s, Peter was like the miserable one. So I think once Eric came in, he maybe brought a bit more sort of a positivity towards the band. So they maybe let Ace get away with a bit more. And also once Peter had gone, Ace didn't really have the voting power that he had when Peter was in the band, because, they were equal partners, whereas Eric was just a paid employee. So, I think they were able to keep Ace under a little bit more rein for a couple of years before he finally left.
There was a 60-minute special in 1980. This is interesting. It was called Super Kiss, aired late April 1980. Then they re-air it early November 1980. The second one makes mention of the departure of Peter Criss. And on July 30th, 1980, Eric Carr is introduced to American television viewers on the show Kids Are People Too. Here's another interesting one. The show aired September 21st of 1980.
We at Kids Are People Too are going to help Kiss welcome their newest member. So please give a big hand for the Fox, Eric Carr. Yeah! Eric, how's it feel now to be a member of Kiss, which is not only a terrific rock group, but a phenomenon almost?
It's great, Michael. It's like a dream come true for me.
It's kind of odd to see them on a kid's show. And as you know, sad for older fans.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously the 60 Minutes was the Australian 60 Minutes, and that was after, because Kiss were just basically like a cult band here in the 70s. They had a couple of minor hits like Rock and Roll All Night had dented the top 10, and Destroyer and Alive had been briefly top 20 albums here, but mostly they were like a low-level cult band while they were superstars in America. It wasn't until Dynasty and I Was Made for Loving You that the popularity out here really broke big. And that's what resulted in Ray Martin from Australian 60 Minutes flying to New York to do an interview with them to cover it, because there was a big controversy out here as well about Kiss being dangerous to the Australian youth and devil worshippers. And that's why 60 Minutes went and covered that. But yeah, Kids Are People Too, I guess they were pretty much one of the only shows that were interested in covering the band at that time, just because of how far their popularity had fallen. And by that stage, the serious sort of mainstream rock magazines like Circus and Cream and Hit Parade still covered them occasionally, but most of the rock press had given up on them. The only magazines that Kiss were getting any coverage in still were the teen mags, like Teen Beat and Tiger Beat. And I remember 16 magazine was one that they were always in, and it was always articles like, Gene's lonely search for love and all these really cheesy teen love story type scoops. And I still went out and brought every issue of 16.
Sure.
I'd always be embarrassed buying it because it would have Matt Dillon or the Dukes of Hazzard on the cover. But, they were the only magazine that still covered Kiss with any regularity. And
didn't People magazine run the picture of the new lineup with Eric Carr?
Yeah, that was about their only mainstream cover for that year when Eric joined. And they did get the cover of Circus that year as well for their anniversary issue. But yeah, definitely their main domain had been the teen magazines. And I guess as a result of that, that's why they were on Kids Are People Too, because that was pretty much their audience. And again, that was a show that we never got over here. I first remember seeing it in reruns when I went on my first vacation to America as a kid in 1981 and seeing it on TV. It came up My mum was like, come on, we're going sightseeing. I'm like, no, Kiss is on TV. We didn't come halfway around the world to watch Kiss.
A true Kiss
But yeah, it
fan.
was kind of like even back then, I was kind of like sad just seeing all these little kids screaming at them, thinking, oh, it doesn't, not really rock and roll, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But that period of Kiss is one of my favorites. Sometimes a band's period when they're struggling and down on their heels can be their most sort of interesting and fascinating.
Oh,
And
100%. And I remember in 1981 when The Elder came out, I had one friend in school. He was still a diehard Kiss fan. He's like, you got to listen to this. He liked The Elder, or he was trying to like it. I think he did. I remember he recorded it for me, gave it on cassette. He was among the few who was still holding on, but otherwise everybody was checking out. And as if you thought it was bad enough when The Kids Are People 2 airs, but then you get The Elder. And this chapter 7 is fascinating. It's titled The Elder, the Movie That Never Was, 1981. Now, I know a tour was planned and scrapped, but there was to be a film to go along with the album.
that was, I think, the initial genesis is in 1981, Kiss were trying to decide what to do next. I think they were a bit lost in terms of their direction. They were trying to record a back to basics rock album, but feeling that the songs maybe weren't quite there. And when they brought Bob Ezrin back into the fold to produce the new album, I think that was when Gene brought up this concept that he'd come up with, a movie called The Elder, which was pretty much like a fairly sort of basic good versus evil story in the Star Wars Excalibur kind of mold, medieval story. And I think once Bob Ezrin sort of saw that idea or read that idea that Gene had, that he was like initially, just come up with for a potential movie that had nothing to do with Kiss. Bob Ezrin was like, this is fantastic. Why don't we do this as the next Kiss album? And Bob Ezrin had just come off The Wall, which was like one of the most successful concept albums of all time, the Pink Floyd album. And Gene and Paul both drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and thought, yep, this is what we need to really impress people and impress the critics, I guess was their plan with that album. They probably figured they also had nothing to lose since their last album, Unmasked, had pretty much bombed in America. But yeah, I mean, over here, Kiss were like the biggest thing in music in 1980. And even over here, by the time The Elder came out, briefly, I think it reached number 11 on the charts in Australia. So it was one of the few places where it actually charted. But within a month, it had just totally gone. Whereas Dynasty was top 5 for like, nearly 2 years running. So even in Australia, The Elder pretty much just totally sunk their career. But I was like your friend, I was still a fan in 1981. I still had a few sort of friends as well that were eager for it. And I think The Elder pretty much killed off most of the remaining fan base over here for a while. But I always liked it. I thought it was an interesting concept. Thankfully, I always had an open mind to all different kinds of music. I wasn't just like, it's got to be heavy metal or nothing. I loved music soundtracks. I loved Frank Zappa and the Cramps and 60s, 70s stuff. So I always had an open ear to all music. So while I was a bit disappointed that Kiss didn't come back with the full hard rock album that they'd been promising the year before, I still thought, well, this is really interesting. And I think when you listen to it with an open mind, certainly the musicianship is fantastic and the production, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I think the general consensus is correct that it's not a bad album. It's just not a good Kiss album. And it certainly wasn't a good Kiss album for the time when they needed perhaps a good, strong, straightforward rock album just to try and get back some of that hardcore fan base that had deserted them after Dynasty and Unmasked. You wonder what might have happened, how their career might have gone if they did come back with a hard rock album.
Who knows? But I think you summed it up perfectly. I think the album as a whole takes a hit, but it's unfair to criticize every song on the album because there's some really good stuff on there. Like I say, the production's really solid. If they had used some of those songs just for a straight ahead Kiss album, I think they would have come off great. Like The Oath, Dark Light.
Dark Light, yeah, probably my favorite track. Fantastic Ace Frehley solo on it, just blistering.
Escape from the Island, Mr. Blackwell, There's some really good songs on there. But as a whole,
yeah, I think
the whole concept thing was just a little too much to take, a little too silly.
Much, and I don't think it was really well thought out. There was always a famous story about when they first played the album for the record execs. They put them in a room and insisted that everyone not talk and just listen to it because they all thought they were going to be exposed to brilliance. I'd love to be a fly on that wall and just see the record companies' faces as the album went on. Because I think initially the original track listing started off with Fanfare, the ballad, and then that operatic song that Paul did, Odyssey.
That's now the order that we hear on streaming services and the re-release.
That's correct. Yeah, they
Yeah.
replaced the original order when they did the remaster
Oh.
CD in the 90s.
Can you imagine the look on their face? You guys are kidding, right? You're kidding, right? All right, bring in the real album.
So I found some memos from the Australian record company at the time. Polygram over here had sent a bill of coin saying this is absolutely not what Australian Kiss fans were hoping to hear from the band, and almost imploring them to just can the album altogether and just get back into the studio. And I think there was also like another memo from the Australian record company saying the best thing to do for us would be to just put out a compilation album and use a couple of the tracks from the new album, like Oath and The Eye, just to fill it out. But Kiss didn't want anything to do with that. They were convinced that they had a masterpiece on their hands, and unfortunately it didn't pan out that way. But as you mentioned, there was a script written, a feature script that no one's ever really been able to read. There was only one copy of it known to exist, which Gene had, and which got sold off at the Kiss auction at Butterfield's in the early 2000s. And I think the guy that brought it, he said he read it himself and didn't really get much out of it, but it would still be a fascinating document to read. The way the album bombed, there was no way any film company was ever going to be interested in producing it, certainly as a feature film. The most I could have thought of is maybe it might have done like a 1-hour TV special or something. But even that, I think the album only reached something like number 75 in America. So it was just totally dead in the water. And I just think it was just a strange concept for them to undertake. You know, even if they did a tour, like how do you mix songs from the older with Rock and Roll All Night and Detroit Rock City? The plans for the tour, the stage set, were pretty bizarre as well. They were going to have like all these figures in medieval robes and like a well of souls. And there was something that was going to be like a something like there was going to be some sort of like invasion of killer bees or something on stage, which they were going to use by rear projections.
Oh man!
Yeah, it would have been a total spinal tap. But I'd still love to see it get done, though. You know, I guess we can look back on it too with a bit more sort of humor and acceptance, because we see now that the band did recover and re-establish themselves. Whereas at the time, after that album came out and after Creatures as well came out and just totally bombed, I was like, well, I think that's the end of Kiss. I can't see where they're going to go from here. So there was a real fear and expectation that, yep, they're on their last legs. They're just dead and buried. All these new bands, Van Halen and Motley Crue and AC/DC, they'd all just totally overtaken them. And especially back then, you just didn't see bands really come back like that. Once your popularity dived, that was it. It was over for you.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, plus a video highlight and a link to our YouTube channel. Links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. We get to 1983 and they make that decision to take the makeup off. That is on MTV, September 18th, 1983. It's 4 days before the album Lick It Up is released, but it's on the same day as the single, the title track, was released. And you write in the book, quote, while it would have seemed like a brave and daring creative decision for Kiss to drop the makeup just a few years earlier, by 1983, it was a move born more out of desperation than anything else.
This is a really big moment. After 10 years together, exclusively here on MTV this evening, we're going to see Kiss without their makeup for the very first time. Very first time out. How does it feel now, without makeup, appearing for the very first time?
It feels good. It feels, we've always been close to our fans. In fact, in a lot of the shows, we'd walk out into the crowd to sort of get a feel of what everybody was feeling like. And most often they really wouldn't know it was us. So we've always felt closer, and I think it's time for them to sort of know us a little bit more. It feels very, very comfortable. I hope it seems that way. I feel fine about it. No, I'm fine.
But actually, it feels great. I mean, to me, it doesn't feel all that different, because I've seen these guys more often without makeup than I have with makeup, so.
That appearance was huge for them. They had to do it.
Yeah, even though it wasn't the period where Kiss would have got the most exposure and the biggest publicity, taking off their makeup would have been in 78, 79. By 1983, they could barely get arrested. There was only 2 original members left. And pretty much any diehard fans had already seen photos of them without makeup by that point. There'd been a few paparazzi shots that had captured Gene and Paul out with their date. They might have been hiding a little bit of their faces, but I think a lot of the mystique had already been gone by that point. And yeah, the
I love
handkerchiefs
that.
and
Yeah, the handkerchiefs.
the menus and tickets. Yeah. But I think there was still like for MTV which was obviously at the height of their power, really. MTV were just huge. That was the place to be if you're a rock band in 1983. And Kiss really struggled to get on MTV during their first couple of years. They weren't really interested in the band. Even the Kiss Unmasking, I think, took place like at 11 o'clock at night on MTV, whereas a few years earlier probably would have been in prime time. But
Sure.
But it still did its job. It definitely helped kickstart the album, and it gave them a new lease of life. And it's fantastic. I mean, I think it was the one ace they still had up their sleeve to try and get a bit of momentum going. And it probably helped that they had a great album under their belt with Lick It Up. It was definitely one of their strongest albums, I thought. Certainly worked for them to a degree. It didn't put them back on the top of the ladder, but it still, I think, Lick It Up went top 20 in America, went gold, and eventually probably platinum, if not more, by these days. Lick It Up became a pretty popular single on MTV, and the video is kind of funny as well, as in the way it's sort of influenced by the post-apocalyptic movies that were so popular around that time, like Mad Max 2 and Escape from New York. So that was another part of the whole interest in me doing the book, was seeing the type of movies and TV shows that also influenced and inspired their music videos. And the whole post-apocalyptic theme was pretty popular amongst most metal bands back then. Motley Crue did similar things with a couple of their videos.
And it set the stage for a decade that they are able to maintain their status as a player in the game. They have a hit single off of each album. They had a video on MTV that did well, and
each album went at least gold. Occasionally platinum, like Animalize. They did Heaven's on Fire. So yeah, they certainly weren't up there with the top heavy metal rock bands, but certainly for a band that were over 10 years into their career, they weren't doing bad. And I think also a lot of it's perception as well. Even if you go back to the 70s when Kiss were at the height of their popularity, they were never like the biggest selling band in America, like Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles and the Rolling Stones. They sold way more albums than Kiss did and played way more tours than Kiss did. Kiss were popular, but that was their whole genius in terms of they were able to market themselves to make you think that they were the biggest band in the world. They were huge, but there was a lot of bands that were bigger. They've never had that album like Bon Jovi had Slippery When Wet, and AC/DC had Back in Black, and Motley Crue had Dr. Feelgood. Kiss had never had that one studio album that just went gangbusters and sold 5 or 6 million albums. But what they did have was a career of constantly selling 1 or 2 million records and constantly playing to 5 to 10,000 people per night. So it's a career I would have been happy with as a rock musician.
Meanwhile, Peter and Ace, they didn't have the best decade, and there's this surreal moment in history, which is in 1991, February 5th, 91, The Donahue Show, and the show is titled Celebrity Imposter. Talk about what we see here.
In 1991, the story came out that Peter Criss, who had pretty much disappeared after he left Kiss, he'd done a couple of solo albums in the first couple of years that did nothing, and then he pretty much just laid low. He was married and I guess had a kid and was just living off his fame that he'd amassed. But yeah, by 1991, the story came out that he'd pretty much lost all of his money and was now an alcoholic and living under a pier in Santa Monica. And I remember first hearing about it on MTV Australia. They did a story where the host, a guy called Richard Wilkins, came out and said, "Oh, we've got a story coming up about original Kiss drummer Peter Criss, who's not a very well boy at the moment." I'm like, "Oh, what's going on?" And then, yeah, he sort of, obviously the Star newspaper story, or the Enquirer, or whatever newspaper it was that was covering it, had just come out. And the story was that he'd basically blown through all his money, had become destitute and an alcoholic. And Tom Arnold from the Roseanne show, who'd been married to Roseanne and was a big Kiss fan as a kid, actually read the story and traveled to Santa Monica to try and find him to see if he could help out. And the Donahue Show, again, we did get the Donahue Show out here at the time, and it showed up, I think it played at like midday over here. And I used to just tune in to see what the subject was going to be every day. And I just tuned in one day and yep, it was like the Kiss episode. And I was like, holy crap, they're covering it. Donahue's covering it. That's a big story.
Not only does this imposter show up, but there's Peter. He comes walking out like, we haven't seen this guy in the longest time, and there he is.
Rock superstar, here's the lead. Rock superstar Peter Criss, the former drummer for Kiss, is a hopeless alcoholic living a pathetic existence on the streets of Santa Monica, California. I've lost it all, Criss told Star, revealing his pitiful plight for the first time. I blew all the money on cars, hotels, people, and bad investments. We were on the top. We were the biggest. May I ask you now to kindly welcome the real Peter Criss. Never met him.
How you doing? Why couldn't you impersonate like the Lone Ranger or Tano or something like that? You've really given me a rocky time.
You want to say something to Peter? You're sorry.
Yes.
The Star takes your picture, and did they say they were from the Star?
No, they didn't. I was in a food line waiting for some food in Santa Monica. They give out hot food, and this writer and photographer came up to me. I just didn't think anything of it. They were taking pictures of a few other people too, and after maybe 20 shots, 30 shots, you know, they said we'd be interested in doing a story, and I was so totally out of it. At that time, I was very sick, had edema and kidney and liver problems.
Uh-huh. And what'd they offer you, $500?
Yeah.
That was around the time his own mum was sick and dying from cancer, and that's why he didn't come out to dispute it at the time, because he had no idea all this was going on. You know, he was more preoccupied and concerned with just being by his mother's bedside. But you're correct, it was just such a bizarre moment in history to see them both there confronting each other, and such a bizarre, strange story. Like
Tom Arnold, it's like,
the
what?
drummer from Kiss, and
Tom Arnold's there.
And unfortunately, I mean, sadly, the impersonator, I believe, died several years later.
He's since passed, yeah.
Clearly had some addiction issues and possibly mental health issues as well. So, yeah, I think he was definitely manipulated in it, but at the same time, he also went along with it as well. But
yeah.
I guess when you're desperate and homeless and an alcoholic, you'll do whatever it takes to get your next drink and roof over your head for a couple of nights.
You do cover the 90s Kiss, which is, of course, you got the big reunion in 96. You cover the MTV Unplugged appearance. You cover the Kiss appearing at the Grammy Awards at the Shrine Auditorium, full makeup. That's when Tupac introduced them. So you got all that in there. Of course, the film Detroit Rock City, 1999. You have the chapter on the film career of Gene Simmons. You cover the Kiss documentaries, interviews with key figures in history. But let's finish with the Kiss influence. This chapter takes a look at some of the more interesting and memorable examples of how Kissploitation infiltrated projects, which in most cases had no connection or affiliation with the band itself. Talk about some of the entries, maybe some of the standout ones for you in this chapter. Linda Carter paying tribute to Kiss as a trip. That's a great one.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the elements of the book that I really enjoyed researching and writing. And it was one of the things that when I first got the idea for doing the book, I was thinking, I caught a rerun of the famous Chips episode from 1982, Halloween. Donnie Most, who played Ralph Malph on Happy Days, plays a controversial gothic glam rock star called Moloch, who has very Gene-like makeup and breathes fire and sings a song called Devil Take Me. And I remember watching that and thinking, wow, this is even more Kiss-inspired than I remembered it. Then I also remembered, there was an old episode of Scooby-Doo that had a Kiss-like character as the villain. So I rewatched that online, and then I started finding other little shows that Kiss had obviously been an inspiration on. So that's what really helped me solidify the approach to the book. And one of the earliest was that Scooby-Doo episode from 1977 called The Diabolical Disc Demon, where the gang go to visit a friend who's a musician in a recording studio, and turns out there's some typical Scooby-Doo story. There's a phantom that's haunting the record studio, but it turns out to just be a guy who's trying to hide the fact that he's stealing albums from the studio and selling them on the street, But the monster in it's called the Diabolical Disc Demon, and he's very much like a Gene Simmons character with the Gene Simmons makeup, and the costume he's got on is very reminiscent of Ace Frehley's Hotter Than Hell outfit. So that's a really interesting early piece of Kissploitation. And then there was a Love Boat from 1979, where one of the characters played by Sonny Bono a rock star called Deacon Dark, who again has the full white face makeup and does the whole show with explosions and fog. And he's also a bit inspired by Alice Cooper as well, I guess, because he's got a pet boa constrictor. So you can sort of see an Alice Cooper influence in there. But I always thought that was interesting as well, being it was Sonny Bono in early 1979. It's kind of around the same time that Gene was dating his real life ex-wife, Cher. So I kind of wonder whether Sonny Bono took on that role to try and show Cher, see, I can be just as good as Gene Simmons, I'm just as good. So there was that. There was also like an episode of Benson from 1979. I don't know if you remember that sitcom Benson.
One of my all-time favorite
that
shows.
was,
I can't remember this episode, and I've seen every one, but it's been so long.
It was one of the very first ones. I think it might have been like maybe the second or third episode where, yeah, the daughter in the show defies the dad's orders and sneaks off to see Kiss with her friend and gets into a lot of trouble. So that was another one that even though Kiss didn't appear in, they were still part of the narrative of the show. There was an episode of The Incredible Hulk where Mackenzie Phillips, the daughter of the Mamas and Papas, John Phillips, plays again another rock star that has a very Kiss-like appearance and very Kiss-like show with a lot of spark machines, and the Hulk ends up getting up on stage at the end to save her because she plans to commit suicide on stage because she's depressed. And that's got a lot of like nice Kiss references as well. When she goes and visits a fan in the hospital and the fan says, "Oh, you look so different without your makeup. I always wondered what you would look like." And actually, the night that it first aired, Kiss were on their Dynasty tour, and I remember they called in to do a radio interview in the city they were playing in the next day, and Ace and Paul start talking about, "Oh, Kiss were on TV tonight. We were on The Incredible Hulk." There was real Kiss-like bands, so they were obviously in their hotel room watching the show when it aired, so that was kind of fun. And there was just so much stuff that came out that did sort of riff on Kiss. You get into the 90s, there was an episode of Homicide, Life on the Street, about a guy from Turkey who's over visiting a friend in America, and they're going to a Kiss party. He's dressed up as Gene Simmons and goes knocking on the wrong door, thinking that's where the party is. And this guy answers, and he just does, because he can't speak English and he's got Gene Simmons makeup on, he's just sort of ranting in Turkish, and the guy that shoots him was the guy that shot the fan dead. Was he right in doing that, in defending his territory, or did he show too much force? But that was a really interesting, more serious sort of angle. And you look at the Millennium TV episode that Kiss themselves appeared on, and it's just really endless. I'm sure there's probably a lot of stuff out there that still to be discovered, because you look at stuff from different countries as well that's yet to surface.
Great research on this. There's a Saturday Night Live episode where this is from the original 70s cast.
Yeah, John Belushi as the doorman at the Kiss show, and the fans are trying to get in. I think Art Garfunkel turns up. He said he parachuted in for the show, and he says he's like I think he pretends that he's Paul Stanley's brother, and I think it's Dan Aykroyd that comes out in the end as Gene Simmons and sort of scares them all away. But that was about the closest Kiss ever got to being on Saturday Night Live, because I don't think Lorne Michaels was a fan of the band, so that was pretty much as close as they got to being covered on that show. Kind of like Rolling Stone, they were both like very anti-Kiss for some reason. I think they maybe were a bit too highbrow, or thought Kiss were a bit too, beneath them. But
stupid.
It was stupid when Eric Carr died and Rolling Stone didn't even mention it. I think that's when they revealed that they're obviously just totally biased, because to totally ignore the death of a rock musician that played on multiple gold and platinum albums and toured the world for 10 years with one of the biggest bands, and Rolling Stone don't even mention their death, where they would mention the death of any other bit part musician normally. I think that just really showed their bias and made them look bad.
The fans will love this book, Creatures of the Screen, the uncensored and unofficial history of Kissploitation on film, television, and home video. The book is out now. Find it wherever books are sold. You can look for it at your nearest bookstore. If you want to find your nearest independent bookstore, you can go to bookedonrock.com. And if they don't have a copy there, ask them to get one. And where can people find you online, John?
I'm on Facebook, of course. You can always do a search there. I've got a blogger as well, Sin Street Sleaze, which has all my writings, or just jharrisonblogspot.com. The book itself can be ordered by Bear Manor, or the publisher, so bearmanormedia.com, also on Amazon, and as you mentioned, other retailers. And hopefully I'll be doing some book signings coming up locally in Melbourne for people who are local, and got a plan to do a bit of a proper launch for the book at one of the big cinemas here, where I'm going to do a bit of a clip and tell and show some of the clips from some of the shows I talk about in the book, and then have a secret screening. So yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to screen at this point, but yeah, there'll be a few fun things. So
yeah,
anyone local, and obviously we'll hopefully film that as well and upload that for people to watch that can't be there.
John Harrison, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Pleasure.